We're going to show you kind of a tale of two P&Ls. And we're going to call one good times and sad times. This owner really, as a decently managed practice, should be making $600,000 a year. And that's why we're calling it sad times. When you have no revenue, that's hard to control. But they have plenty of revenue. It's really an expense problem.
We had one practice, they were paying $40,000 for their fish tanks. And we found out that that was a spouse of a person that was working at the practice.
Holy moly.
That was writing the checks, right? So you got to pay attention. I'm sad, John. I'm sad. I'm sad for this owner. I just saw them last year. I hope they pop up. I think they will.
The same brain that can interpret a lab value on a chemistry panel can interpret a value on a profit and loss statement. All right, welcome back to the Vet Launch Podcast. I'm Dr. John Younker, and in today's episode, we're going to do some profit and loss statement analysis from two real-life veterinary practices. And joining me in today's discussion is Professor Jeff Sanford from the UGA College of Veterinary Medicine. Jeff is the Director of Financial Literacy and Practice Outreach, and part of his role is teaching veterinary students about financial literacy, and he also leads the Practice Management Senior Elective Rotation at UGA, where he and his students solve real business problems inside of veterinary practices. Jeff has literally analyzed over 1,000 veterinary practices in his career and has probably seen more profit and loss statements than anyone I know. There is no one better to help us understand how to take a profit and loss statement and start making strategic decisions about how we grow our practices. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Jeff Sanford. All right, welcome back to the Vet Launch Podcast. I'm Dr. John Younker, and today I have a honorable guest, my friend, professional mentor, creative collaborator. If you've ever heard any of the concepts of this podcast, Jeff Sanford is always behind the scenes. Jeff and I have a long-standing relationship. And honestly, a great deal of my success has to do with our relationship. And just so thankful, Jeff, that you're here. Looking forward to today's conversation, super practical. We're going to dive into real profit and loss statements. Jeff goes all over the country looking at vet clinics and helping them solve real business problems on a practice rotation with veterinary students. And what we're going to show you today is real life profit and loss statements that have actually occurred in the past year. We're going to show you kind of a tale of two P&Ls. And we're going to call one good times and sad times. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, John. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. As you know, a lot of people don't know about financial statements, and I'm so glad you're doing this.
You're right. We talk all the time, and you'll hear me say this literally like over and over and over again, which is the same brain that can understand veterinary medicine can understand financial concepts. The same brain that can interpret a lab value on a chemistry panel can interpret a value on a profit and loss statement. Jeff, why don't we just talk about P&Ls for a refresher? If you don't know how to read a P&L, please look at episode 12 on how to read a P&L. I'll go over simply how to do that. But today we're going to actually look at real P&Ls and dive in. But Jeff, maybe let's talk about at a high level the main expense buckets on a P&L and what really veterinarians should be looking at.
Well, as like you discussed in the last podcast, you have basically 5 or 6 buckets, right? And one is your revenue bucket, right? You got to pay attention to your revenues. What's happening to them? Are they going up? Are they going down? You also have controllable factors, and those control factors are your cost of goods. And what that is the stuff that you consume to do what you do. That is pharmaceuticals. That is supplies for your surgery. It is also cremation. It's also people that you bring in that do surgeries or do whatever services, x-rays, whatever you do. That is part of your cost of goods. The next control bucket is your labor. And what you did with the great podcast last time was you talked about labor and also breaking out your staff from that labor. So looking at your labor. So cost of goods and your labor are the two things that you have the most control of moving up and down. And that's usually what we see happening is all the other expenses are kind of stagnant. They're kind of the same. And so the next bucket is your overhead bucket, and that's everything from advertising to insurance to uniforms. It's everything that you got to do to pay to be open, but you're not doing really any work. That's what that area is. And the last piece is always what we call EBITDA, or we'll just kind of generally call it the profitability of the practice. And those are your main buckets. And those are the things that you have to look at regularly to see if you're on track. And I'm blown away by how many practices do not get monthly statements, meaningful statements from their CPAs to manage these big buckets that really do make up how well you're doing and how much money you're making.
Absolutely. I think first off is organizing the P&L. We discussed last week about the AHA chart of accounts, well-managed practice benchmarks. They have, and even Jeff Sanford, I showed a screenshot of that, of Jeff's profit and loss statement. You can totally take that profit and loss statement and give it to your accountant, and that will organize all of the buckets so that you can compare your practice's performance compared to another. We talk about expenses as a percentage of revenue. So if cost of goods sold, if you have $1 million of revenue and you spend $200,000 on your cost of goods sold, 200,000 divided by $1 million, your cost of goods sold would be 20% of revenues. Right. So whenever you hear us say a percentage of revenues, that's kind of what we're talking about. And the reason why we talk about it as a percentage of revenues is because everyone's revenues are slightly different. If you just say, I spend $200,000 on COGS, then that doesn't mean, that could mean like terrible if your revenue is $500,000, but allowing to think things through as a percentage helps us compare practices that are different sizes. So
John, can I make one quick point is you have to make sure the integrity of the statements are good. And one of the things that I find is when you're relying on a practice manager that used to be a technician that has no experience except on QuickBooks, what I find is a mess because you're not relying on the professionals who know how to put these statements together for you to make the best decisions. You're relying on someone just to write checks and put things in appropriate categories, but they tend not to be appropriate because they don't have a CPA background or even an accounting background.
Yeah, totally. I think that's well said. What people end up saying is, oh, you shouldn't spend that $1,000, $1,200 a month on an accountant. You shouldn't spend that because you're practice manager, or you could do this after hours on in your free time. And if you realize what the billable rate for this is, you would realize that having an accountant do these things is actually a lot cheaper than if you were to like do it yourself. And so very important. And also garbage in, garbage out, right?
Right.
So if you bring the data in and it's garbage, it's hard to, I used an analogy last week about these are the gauges to drive your car or fly your plane, or you have to have the right gauges so you know where you're going. So incredibly important. So commit this to memory. Revenue, is it going up, down? You know, where's it going? Trends. COGS, 20 to 23% of revenues going down the line. Payroll, 40% total, should not exceed 40%, of which you want your staff payroll to be somewhere in the 14 to 20% range. And then everything else, which is overhead, the bucket that kind of contains all those things that Jeff, 15%. 20, 40, 15%. Add those up, you get 75%. So what's left over, 25%, is EBITDA. 20, 40, 15, 25% profitability. Everything else, we're just trying to figure out why the 20 is off. Why is the 40 off? Why is the 15% off? That's really all we're trying to figure out. And so that's the simplicity of what we're trying to impart on you guys today. Great. So let's dive in. I think probably a good place to start is sad times.
Sad times. And it was sad. It was sad. Sad Times is a pretty good sized practice. It has currently has 4 or 5 doctors. And one of the things that we saw was there has been some changes. They had an ownership change. They're pretty full staffed. They're located in a suburban area, southeastern town, where there's a critical mass of people. It's not like a rural area. It's got a lot of people in the area. Also, a lot of competitors. I'd say there's probably 10 practices within 3 miles of this practice. So lots of competition. And I would say overall, they did not have a CPA looking over their financials monthly. They were relying on a practice manager. And one of the things that we find is practice managers, as long as things are getting paid and everybody's getting paid, sometimes they don't manage it well if they don't understand the financials. And so that's what was happening is this practice was kind of driving blind because they didn't have the systems in place to be able to manage the KPIs, the key performance indicators, as the the 20, 40, 50, right? That is it.
Right. Old adage, what gets measured gets managed. And if you're not measuring anything, it's hard to
Right.
manage it.
Right. This practice was also what people consider a lower end practice. It wasn't a high quality care. It was more of a, I'd say, lower medium practice, right?
Okay. So let's dive in. We talked about what's the first thing to look at. So we've pulled up the profit and loss statement. And if you're listening to this, I'm going to try to give you things verbally. You can stop the podcast right there and actually go to YouTube. You can see all this visually if you're listening. Let's start where we would start any profit and loss statement, and that's right at the top with revenues. This practice has about $3.2 million in revenue. And Jeff, how would you say 3.2 on the scale of like the average clinic? Where does that revenue sit compared to other
I
clinics?
would say right in the middle.
Right. I would agree. 2.5, 3.2. This is like an average clinic. And Jeff and I were very intentional about choosing. We want a fairly common revenue number here to give you kind of a real life example. And so, Jeff, what would you say? What is the change year over year for Sad Times? They're at 3.2.
They were higher a few years prior. They've been dropping in revenues.
Okay.
As what we've been seeing across the country, a drop of invoices has now turned into a drop of revenues.
Right. That is a whole other episode that I think we'll
I think
definitely invite you back over because we're still in the process of getting data. As we were recording this is in June 2026, but it certainly is an emerging threat to the entire industry, which we'll talk about with an extended episode. But so we have revenues and at 3.2 million, and then we immediately go to cost of goods sold. Jeff, why don't we talk about cost of goods sold here with Sad Times?
Cost of goods sold. Remember that includes all the stuff of what you do, the things that you do. That's the cost of that. So that's your prescriptions. That is your supplies for medical supplies. That's also labs if you send them out or have the supply for those labs. It's your vaccines. It's all in there. And one of the things that you want to try to do is what you want to get down to the low 20s, and even below that if you can. But when you're not managing it, we're seeing practices. Oh my gosh, this is actually not bad. It's bad, but I've seen as high as 50%. And at this practice, I would say that it was not one thing that got it up to 30%. It was a host of things. And that percentage, that 29%, you have to remember that's a combination of the cost of what that cost of those materials and pharmaceuticals, but it's also in relevance to the revenues.
You
And
have a
so
numerator and a denominator.
right. And well, I think what most people do is they say, oh my God, I've got 29%, 30%. I need to cut back on inventory. And that is the number one place you do start is, do you have excess inventory? But don't forget, you got the other part of the equation, which is the revenue piece. Inventory. Oh, you want to talk about inventory, John?
Yeah, absolutely. The big high level on cost of goods sold. So
right.
This clinic spent $960,000 on cost of goods sold, and so
90,000 a month, right? 80,
right.
90,000 a month, right? That's a
So
lot.
960,000 divided by 3.2 million gets you 29%. So
Right.
that's kind of the math where we when we talk about 29%. So, the benchmark, remember, 20 is the goal, 20 to 23. It's increasingly hard to get it down below 23 without several factors we'll talk about. But the big high level of how you would get COGS down, there will be a whole episode on how we manage this, but we'll talk about it at a high level. First is you have too much. You're ordering too much, spending too much. You have too
Right.
much on hand. The next is you're not marking it up appropriately, right? So you don't have enough margin, profit margin on the products you're selling. Those are the probably 80% of the power of COGS, probably, if
Right.
is the amount you have on hand and what you're charging for that. And then you have some other factors that do contribute to a cost of goods sold, but at maybe less of a power. And the next one would be your mix. I give an example the last episode on how if I'm an ophthalmologist, right, and I'm doing like lens cataract surgery and doing eye meds, I'm going to have a very refined pharmacy. I'm just going to have like eye drops and some maybe basic pay meds sitting on the shelf. I don't have a huge amount of product sitting on the shelf. And I have very expensive services that I'm providing in the surgery OR. Those clinics will actually have quite a low cost of goods sold because they have both high services, that's the denominator, but also the numerator is smaller because they actually don't have to spend as much money because their pharmacy is quite small.
Right. John, let's talk about behavior. The behavior behind a high cost of goods, this is typically what we see in practices. You have an owner who starts a practice and they're in control of the whole inventory. They know what's kind of going on. And then the practice gets a little bigger and they don't have time to do that inventory. So what do? They elect usually a technician that has an interest in inventory. I'll start managing the inventory for you. And what typically happens there is they don't want the doctors to be mad at them. So they order too much inventory so they don't run out. Or what happens to them is they get hit with all these pharmaceutical reps that come in and she wants to be liked by them. And all of a sudden he or she is buying too much inventory because they just like the person that's coming in, right? And so then you've got what I call bloated pharmacies, which is where you have too much inventory, right? What you don't have is a person that's looking at the history of what you're purchasing. You're not looking at the turns of that inventory, which should be 10, 12, 14 times, right?
Turns meaning how you are like going through selling the entire pharmacy.
Exactly. And also, to your point, what is the margins? What are the margins of that pharmacy? And, you could do a real quick exercise. Just take your cost of goods, then add up all the categories that require pharmacy and look at that margin. If it's under 20%, you don't have enough margin on your pharmacy, right? And so you need to pay attention to that. Margins are really important. And I've been in practices that didn't do filling fees. John, what type of drugs would you want to make sure you have a filling fee for?
Generics, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. Probably some of your NSAIDs, probably some of your antibiotics, right? You want that only cost pennies, right? You want to put at least a $15 to $20 filling fee, if not.
Right, because
right?
the same amount of labor and expertise went into filling generic prednisone than it did an expensive
Right.
Apoquel.
And you have to order it. You got to put it on the shelf. I mean, you got to manage it. So there's more to it than just prescribing it.
And for a deep dive on how you would do that, we have a whole episode on how to set prices.
Not today. Not today.
Not today,
Right?
but that is a huge contributor to COGS. But back to Jeff's point about behavior, COGS is so behaviorally driven. You hear the term FOMO, fear of missing out. Here's another one, FORO, fear of running out, right? I'm so
Right.
scared of running
Right.
out. You may not want to hear this, but if you're not running out of items every now and again, you're probably not lean enough. Most of the times we can get medications tomorrow for the most part. But you want to make sure that it's lean enough and have someone that has the time and space and behavior. I think at a clinic around 3 million, they should seriously consider a part-time inventory manager to
Totally agree.
manage. They spent $900,000, and really they should be, let's say
Let's say
10%.
let's say 5%. If they can get it down to 25%, right, or 24%, that's 5% of 3 million. That's 150,000, 200,000 that they're missing out on at least.
And if you paid a part-time person, I don't know, 40,000 a year,
right?
would you say that'd be a good investment? I spent 40,000 on labor to get back 150,000 on
Plus.
COGS.
Yes. Plus.
The cool part about COGS, when you engage in behaviors to improve it, we actually see if someone really gets control, gets inventory manager, really looks deeply at their maybe top 100 items in their pharmacy, we usually can see responses in cost of goods sold within 90 days, which is really, really cool, which is why we're spending so much time on this in today's episode, is because this is the expense that you have most control over, is cost of goods sold.
And Dr. Younker, you also have to remember that, every doctor has their belief system and they want their own pharmacies, right? And what happens when that happens? Your pharmacy gets bloated.
Right. And so not having two things that do the same thing.
Right.
So
how many ivermectins, how many moxidectins, how many do you need? The average practice has 14 different preventions. Why?
And a lot of it is because we don't want to engage in difficult conversations with our fellow veterinarians to really deeply understand why you use this medication. Why do you use marbafloxacin versus enrofloxacin? Why do you use minocycline versus doxycycline?
Right.
A lot of people haven't really said, you know what, that's just what I've always done, as opposed to actually have a medical scientific reason about it. So,
and what's your criteria for keeping stuff on your shelves, John?
Everything has to fight for a place on the shelf. We actually have to use it.
And how do you evaluate that?
If something expires, then it actually goes to a doctor's meeting. So if we have a medication that expires, and it's not like an emergency drug, like you want epinephrine to expire, but anything else that expires, we actually have to have a discussion at a doctor's meeting that we have monthly or every other month that goes over, hey, do we actually need this medication in there? If we have redundant items, so I would say carprofen and Galliprant would be an example of that. Do we need to have a doctor's discussion why there's a reason why both of them need to exist? And if there are certain individual patients that need it, can we just order ahead of time and have them come tomorrow? And if someone wants to bring in a new medication, they need to have a real rationale on why this is a unique medication that deserves a spot on the shelf, not because it's brand new and we want to just quote unquote try it out, but because there's a medical rationale for why it's there.
Right. And I call this a stuffed animal treatment, right? My daughters had lots of stuffed animals. It seemed like every week we were getting stuffed animals. And my wife said, okay, you can have them on your bed, but you can only have 20. If you bring in one more, you got to let one go. It has to be someone else's levy.
20 is generous too.
Right. So, but if you're going to bring one on, you got to take one off. And I think that's a healthy way. And you also have a criteria of what's good for what. What's good for what? What's good for what?
The patient, client, and clinic in that order.
Right? I think that is so important, is to evaluate your practice on those three criteria. Right?
So very important. Cost of goods sold. So it's not the most egregious here in sad times, but like we said, there is somewhere in the order of $150,000, $300,000 of missed profit because of a variety of different reasons. It's usually not one thing. They probably ordered too much. Their margins are probably not appropriate on their items, and they probably don't have a practice manager or an inventory manager that's really laser focused on getting this down. And so it just tends to creep, especially in the past couple of years as inflation has creeped up. Managing this number has been harder and harder and harder.
Very much so. If you look at the benchmarks, we have benchmarks to the right, 23, 24, 22, right? As a percent of revenues. That's where you kind of need to be going. One of the things that people aren't paying attention to is that relation to revenues. Dr. Younker did point out that, if your mix is off, that will be that. I will tell you this. Lately, I have seen that, especially with the changing of going from like AviMark or Cornerstone to more cloud-based systems, that there's lots of mess ups in that. I've actually seen labs that were charged, like I saw a CBC that was charged only $2. I've seen a urinalysis was charged $4. I've seen stuff that was charged at cost. And the issue with that is that it's your PIMS. You have to clean up your PIMS and review your PIMS to make sure that you're charging the right things and making sure you're getting the right margins on things. The other piece is the cancer. What's the cancer, John?
Discounting. It's
Discounting,
the
right?
cigarette smoking of the
Right?
vet world. Everyone is addicted to it, and it's bad for your
Yeah.
clinic's health.
We were at a practice that they were giving away 10,000 a week. That's 500,000 a year, right? And if you're suppressing revenues by $500,000 a year, and I would say the average practice it's 250 a year. If you're suppressing that, it's going to be hard to get that margin, that common size, that 23%, because your revenues are being driven down, your costs will be driven up.
Right. You shrunk the denominator by
Right.
discounting.
Exactly.
Great. Anything else, Jeff, on cost of goods sold? This is all awesome stuff. Anything else?
It is one of the things that most practices can benefit from is an inventory manager and actually managing the inventory, right?
Right. Yeah. Looking at your top 100 products, your top 100 services, you're going to capture 80-90% of your revenues by just looking at those 100 items each. So, all right. So we're at cost of goods sold. Let's go down to payroll. Jeff, could you let's go over sad times as payroll.
Sad times payroll. I think this practice, no one likes to fire anybody. Right? They felt bad. They all became friends and they all working together, and they actually got a little too inflated, meaning they were under capacity for their doctors and their teams. So all of a sudden, you got staff wages up at 26%. And associate wages at 22.7%. My opinion is I think your doctors, because they're not earning all the income from a practice. You got refills, you got other stuff. They should be in the high teens though, right? They should be 18-ish. But when you get up into the 22s, it means your doctors are working under capacity, that they're not generating enough revenue per doctor. And that's what they had. They were probably one or two doctors heavy, and a lot of staff. They actually had two practice managers being paid well, right? So you can evaluate, what is the overhead payroll, meaning support, right? Especially practice management support, as well as I consider CSRs. I've seen some bloated people who didn't have good systems with their phone systems, didn't have good ways for clients to be directed to where they needed to go. And I've been in practices that had 6, 10 CSRs. You don't need that, right? You need better systems in place. But the other thing is practice managers. What do you pay a practice manager? How many do you need? Do you need one for HR? Do you need one for the financials? I don't know, but that should not get your payroll for staff shouldn't get over 20% ish.
Right. As at a $3.2 million practice, really one
Right.
practice manager should be able to handle that scale. Now, if you were to double that, I would say there needs to be a management layer,
Right.
probably at a $6 million practice. But at a 3.2, most practices have one practice manager, and maybe there's some sub managers there, like an inventory manager or like, a over reception, that type of thing. But having multiple practice managers at this is quite expensive.
Right. So if you look at this practice, we're looking at, 53% is going toward not the owner, it's going toward everybody else. And that you should be, again, around 40%. That's a good number to be at, 40%. So think about that, 10% of 3.2 million. That's 300,000.
Another 300,000 of
Right.
revenue that they've missed.
So we've got roughly what? We've got roughly 200 plus thousand in cost of goods. We got 300,000. We've got $500,000 wrapped up in the stuff that an owner and practice manager should be able to control.
Right.
these two levers, this should be the easiest things or not the easiest things, but this is the things that you need to manage.
Right. With staff payroll, it's hard to undo them once they're a problem because it can be quite painful. Because a lot of times the remedy is a headcount
Yeah,
reduction, and that's quite painful and potentially could touch revenues if you're growing. But a lot of times it's don't make the hire until you've looked at your budget. And
right.
so, am I in budget or not? And so, super important there.
Well, Dr. Younker, I think also in these times with the drop of invoices that we're starting to see, I think if we start seeing a drop in revenues, this could be an issue that there should be a plan of of basically if we see a drop like we did in 2010, we might have to adjust payroll and be ready for it.
Another thing worth mentioning here that is not on this P&L, but is increasingly becoming a larger item, especially in the corporate space, is contract labor. Relief vets are quite expensive and are a great way to get your payroll out of a complete whack. Jeff, do you maybe have some insights on contract labor?
I do. I've been in practices where 80% of the doctor time was contract labor. They were relief vets. You can't grow practices that way. And part of it is I do believe that there is something to this adage of part-time work, part-time commitment. And when you have part-time commitment, you're not making the recommendations that you should be. I find that a lot of relief doctors, they don't want to make recommendations that is going to impose the medicine on the next day, right? So they'll shortcut labs and other things and just do what they can do today so that they don't have to come back again or have to make phone calls or any of that type of stuff, right?
Right. And some of it is out of good intention. They're not trying to do that to like hurt the
No,
clinic. It's like they want continuity of care for their patient, but they've maybe got it out of whack that they're sacrificing quality care for they don't have to follow up
right,
or make another veterinarian follow up for them.
right,
So, staff wages are probably the most of in the payroll sub buckets. It's the most important one that you have a ability to control, and it's really we want it to be 14 to 20%. 14 is better than 20, but it's really making sure that that total payroll bucket doesn't exceed 40. I think that's super important.
right. At the same time, you don't want to get too low in this bucket either. I have seen practices that were like around 30, 32% recently. And part of that's because they're not paying their people appropriately, right? And you're kind of taking advantage of the people. And what we see is a much higher turnover in those practices because the pay is low, or there might be rural and you're just capturing those people because they can't find another place to work. If we can get your practices up to a profitable amount, pay your people,
Exactly. You can keep your payroll at 40% and pay your people appropriately.
right?
What Jeff and I are not telling you is to be a cheapo boss and cheap out on wages. You can actually have both. They're not mutually exclusive ideas.
Right.
Um,
I'd rather have a much lower cost of goods and a higher payroll than the other way around.
Absolutely. Invest in your people so they can invest in your patients.
Right.
Absolutely. I think to talk about too is this owner's compensation. When we talk about total payroll, we usually talk about it without owner's comp. So we take out, Jeff, why do we take out owner's compensation when we talk about total payroll?
Because owners pay themselves so arbitrarily. I mean, it just depends on what they want to take home on a paycheck, right? But they get all the rest. So they can take dividends anytime, but the payroll, some people have a belief that I won't pay myself much, so I don't have to pay Social Security. I don't know if I agree with that, but that's part of it. Other people, they pay themselves, I'm worth this, or they look at their production. I think the production piece makes more sense because if you're producing, you put that number in. But then you got a question of managing. How much are you managing? If you're not producing, but you're managing, you should pay yourself a manager's fee at least in there. So, but overall, what we find is it's just arbitrary. Whatever the owner wants to, whatever they can't afford to pay themselves, they pay themselves whatever they think is appropriate.
And that also allows us to compare your practice to another practice, because if owners have different thoughts and rationales on how they pay themselves, then it can be almost impossible to compare your payroll to
Yeah,
theirs.
you can't do it. Now, what is interesting is if you have lots of partners, you can skew this because you'll have, like, I've been in practices that had three partners, and all of a sudden you've got compensation for three partners underneath owner's compensation. That's going to skew your payroll. So just be aware that this is like one owner and all the rest compensation. But there are several practices that have partnerships, and it will skew the associate wages, especially. And also, if you take out doctor pay, it's going to make your numbers look a lot lower.
Another way to have very low payroll is when the owner is the huge breadwinner producer.
Yes,
And especially like in year maybe one or two, where they haven't really settled on a owner's compensation, like a salary. Maybe they're in their S corp process, they haven't really determined what their reasonable wage is. And if you're wondering, if you're like, what does that mean? We have a whole episode on how to set your like
right.
wage on entities and tax structures. But
I,
they can really overproduce. They could produce over $1 million in revenue personally, pay themselves like $50,000 of a salary, and let that all fall to the bottom. And you can have payroll kind of be very skewed as well.
John, that's a very good point. And let me make this point. Between 2 and 3 million is where we start seeing practices change from an owner operator to more of a CEO type of
Yes.
position. And to do that, you shouldn't be producing 1.5 to 2 million. You should be backing down your production and putting in systems, which means you have to have the right staff wages and as well as other associates to take care of the production so that you can manage this practice for growth. What we see too often is to that point is these mega producers, they don't have time to manage.
Right. They became an owner because they're typically it's self-selecting for mega producers. So these mega producers, great associates, they see that they're tired of, every time they get a production check on average, their boss is getting that, netting that personally for them as profit, and they say, I'm going to go start my own practice so that I can reap the benefit, which is phenomenal. They go start their practice. They are huge producers. They're seeing more, profit to them. They're making more money than they ever had. They get around 2 million. Maybe they have one associate. They're still like hoofing it, like $1+ million of personal revenue just to them, the founder, that they're contributing as a clinician. And then what ends up happening is we see around 2.5 million that the growth of the organization tends to like level off. And a lot of that is they're spending too much time being a veterinarian and not enough time, like Jeff said, in building the systems or going and recruiting another associate, having the time and space so that they can get out of the way. They actually find that they are themselves the bottleneck.
Right?
They can't go beyond 3.2 million, 2.5 to 3.2 million, because that requires another associate to do that. How they need time and space to go find them. They actually need a place that like where it's a great place to work and not just a place that everyone's drowning, and
Right?
that the owner is incentivized because they're making all this money. And so, but not everyone else has the same incentives as the founder or the owner. So very, very important thing, Jeff. We'll have a whole episode. I think I'll invite Jeff back for the transition from DVM to CEO. That's a whole other
Right?
episode. And that happens right here at this like 3 million, 2.5, 3 million mark.
Right?
So, all right. I think that's it for payroll. Jeff, do you have anything to add on payroll?
I think that's good. Right?
Okay,
You're either at capacity or under capacity, right? In a case like this, where you're
right.
overpaying.
Totally. All right, on to overhead. Or Jeff has labeled this as other expenses, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to talk about this and call that overhead. It's like a garbage can. It's pretty much everything that's not COGS and payroll that you need to operate the business. We have some non-operating
Right.
expenses we'll talk about. But to operate the business, and we're talking about like marketing or advertising, from what you're paying for your PIM software to your rent. But Jeff, maybe like what's the most like the highlights of all these kind of like 20 plus things that we have in overhead? What are the things that really move the needle on overhead?
Well, overhead, again, you got to pay attention to who's writing the checks. If you're writing the checks, it's great. But if you have others writing the checks, there's also what I call expense creep. I had one practice that was paying $30,000 a year for their garbage. And the owner, after I showed this to the owner went to the practice manager and said, "Why are we paying 30,000?" She said, "Well, that's just what we're paying." And he called up another competitor and got it down to $150 a month. Right. And so they're paying 30,000. And I had someone also was being charged close to 8% for credit card fees. And oh, that was, and I had that owner call the bank, and the owner, the banker kind of laughed and said, "Boy, we've been putting it to you for a long time, haven't we?"
Oh my gosh.
Right. And it should be under 2%, around two and under 2% ideally, but around 2.3, somewhere in that range, right? So that's usually a pretty good number. This practice is at almost 20%. And if you look down, you can see that credit card fees are on the high side. You probably need to start negotiating those things at least yearly to keep those down. You can see you also have your software. You're going to have every year you got to pay for your PIMs, right? Dues and subscriptions. Education and seminars. I'm always a little disappointed with this at $3,000 because if your people are getting trained, I would think it'd be a much bigger number,
Right.
right? But look at insurance. That probably in this case was all dumped into. That's probably mostly health. Health is expensive, so you can see that's a big piece. If we were to move that up to labor, we'd have even more labor, right? We
Right.
could we could we we
This
could
should
move
be
it.
business insurance, right? So health
Yeah,
insurance
it
should be
should be.
more of an employee benefit
I
up in
I
payroll. But
I,
if the
I
accountant doesn't separate it out, it can be very challenging.
right. I,
Yeah.
I I agree. What blew my mind was professional services. $100,000 for professional services practice paid. I said, what? How what are you paying for? What information are you getting to where you have almost a negative earnings, negative profitability? I mean, you should be paying, if you're paying people, they should be providing you services that make your practice better,
Yeah. So tell me,
right?
what would be an example of professional services, Jeff?
Oh, that's good. Well, one is your attorney, but most people use is their accountant, their
Right.
CPA, right? So you're paying that. And you should be paying, probably, my guess is for a good CPA, somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 at least a year, right? Especially if you're talking to them regularly and they're providing you monthly statements, you should be paying for that because you need the KPIs so that your cost of goods aren't high all the time and your payroll's not high all the time and your overhead's not high over the time, right? So I think they're overpaying. You'll also notice that one of the other big buckets on the overhead expense is rent. Rent, it is what it is. What's nice about most of these expenses, except for your credit card fees, as you grow, these expenses get smaller as a percent, right? So you're making more money, you're bringing in more revenues. These numbers actually drop as a percent. Other things you'll find is taxes and licenses. That's usually property taxes. Some people put sales tax in there too. Travel and entertainment. That is you going to the conferences or doing things with your people. That's where that would go. And then uniforms. And that number should be around 15, 16%. It might be higher when you're a startup. It might be around 20, 22%, but mature practice that's 3 million, it should be around 15%. You can see we've got another 5%. So we got at least 5% in cost of goods. We got 10% in payroll. We got 5% here. That's 20% that we're mismanaging.
Right. And it's not one glaring thing, right? I mean, outside of
No.
professional fees, it's a couple a percentage here or a percentage there, but because there's 20 like items that they start to stack because it's clear, I don't know sad times, but it does appear that no one's really paying attention for the expenses. Everything's creeping up a little bit and there's and I would say there's less expense discipline going on here as a kind of a general thought as I look
right?
at sad times.
And a lot of times you'll find things are negotiable.
Right.
You can negotiate terms with your bank. You can negotiate terms with your insurance company. You can negotiate stuff. You
So
just have to get on the phone.
I would tackle this, I'd really kind of start, what's the biggest outlier? Professional services is by far the
Right.
biggest outlier here. I would kind of say, what am I getting with my accountant? Am I getting my P&Ls on the 15th of every month? Are they organized in a way that I can benchmark it? Am I getting the key performance indicators that Jeff, if you're not getting that, then you're not getting the value of your accountant, and you need to either have a reset calibrations with your accountant or find a new one, because
Right.
this is very expensive for this professional
It
services.
is. It should be $70,000 less than this.
Right.
I mean, think about $70,000 that should be on the bottom line for you. It's not there. You're sticking it to professional services. That's just wrong.
And then, the next thing I would probably look at would be the bank and credit card fees. How would I go ahead? We talked about renegotiating it. How do you do that? Essentially, what you do is you try to get the best rates possible. I've seen a lot of people use their group purchasing organization, GPO. They often will have relationships with credit card providers and to get lower credit card fees. And then you basically threaten to leave your existing credit card processor because
Right.
you have a competing offer on the table. I have found that 9 times out of 10, your existing provider will just match the rates because they're waiting for you to negotiate. They're like, well, we're not going to drop the price until you come and renegotiate that. There's also an emerging thing, Jeff, on the passing the credit card fees on to the owner. Honestly, that could be a whole other episode. I think that I don't have a fully developed opinion on that. I do think I would be cautious towards it because depending on what value proposition that you have to the client. If I pass 100% of the credit card fees on to the client, yes, it's going to be cheaper for me, but you better not be a high touch customer service boutique kind of medicine, because you don't get that in other kind of like high touch, high service organizations in your regular life.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not gonna pay $5, $6, $7, $800 and you're gonna put a $3% fee because I'm using my credit card. That's just wrong to me, right?
Now, if you're a low cost, high volume practice and you're really trying to drill the cost down as low as possible, and you're cool with people paying cash and having to manage cash and all the things that come along with the risk of having a cash heavy business, then I would say all means go for it, and that would fit your business model. I would just be careful on deciding that and what your local market may, and pay attention when you go to a coffee shop or other like experiences. Do they pass the fee on to you, and how do you feel as a client, a customer, when someone does that to you?
Whatever you do, just manage your expectations and make sure the clients know what's going to happen. Right? No one likes surprises.
Right. With overhead, a lot of it is fixed, except for credit card fees, meaning the price is what it is. Sometimes you can renegotiate it. Sometimes, like rent, you made a decision a year ago, 5 years ago, having appropriate representation on rent to know you're getting a competitive rate, super, super important, because really rent is probably the most expensive thing here. Credit card fees.
It is the biggest expense.
Yeah. And then I would say maintenance, advertising, those type of things. Those are probably the biggest buckets here. But really just having expense discipline to see these things creep up and then get curious about why they may be over the benchmark. And then do I have the power to go renegotiate these things and get them down?
Right. It's also a way that you can pay attention. If someone's stealing from you, it might be in one of these things. We had one practice, they were paying $40,000 for their fish tanks. And we found out that was a spouse of a person that was working at the practice.
Holy moly.
That was writing the checks, right? So you got to pay attention. You just got to pay attention.
You don't have a lot of control over your revenue, but you dang well have control over your expenses.
Right.
The best business people control their expenses, and it's not someone who's greedy. It's someone that's being a good steward of their money. And so if you want to invest back in your practice, invest back in your people, you got to have expense discipline. So, right, 20 40, 15, what's left over is EBITDA. So we have EBITDA or operating profit, but EBITDA is basically what is the profitability of you doing veterinary medicine and the core function of medicine in your business. It's not the true profit. Actually, there are other kind of expenses that we're going to talk about in just a second on this that is involved with that. But when we look at EBITDA, you're just looking at the profitability of the performance of veterinary medicine in your practices. That's why we look at it. It's also part of how someone might value your practice, a multiple of EBITDA.
Right.
So a well-managed practice should be about 20 to 25%. Obviously, more is better. Jeff, what's going on at sad times? I see a parentheses here. What does parentheses mean?
Parentheses means you're losing it.
It's negative.
You're losing
it's a negative
money,
number.
right? It's bad. And this is what you do. This point is everything that you do as a business before the accountant gets to it. This is what your real profitability is for what you do. And what do we see? Our cost of goods, there was 200,000. Our payroll, there was almost 300,000, right? And our overhead, that was another 5%. That's another 150. So you add those up, that should be where that number is. And it's not. It's a negative 81. And so if you're in the negative, and what's sad is if this practice has debt, we don't consider the principal payments in a profit and loss statement. Or if you bought equipment, that's not part of a profit and loss statement. And so there's other things that could drive your cash flow even further down than this profit.
Right. Very important when someone talks about EBITDA, that is not what the clinic did in terms of cash flow or what free cash flow or the income to the owner. There's a lot of kind of terms for that. It is not what the profit of the practice. In fact, it often overstates cash. And the main limitation of a profit and loss statement is because it does not capture capital expenses, if any of them are going on, because there is some sort of capital expenses here, because I can see a depreciation, which we'll get in just a second. And it looks like there's no loans that was reported because the interest expense is zero on this. And so why do we talk about EBITDA with and without the owner's compensation?
Well, because the owner's compensation is arbitrary.
Right.
So you always look at them, and the benchmarks are based on not having owner's compensation in it. So we can benchmark better.
So if we include the owner's compensation, it actually makes us look less profitable. But if we add that back to what's left at the end, the negative number is less negative in this example. And so it's in order to correct it and compare to other practices.
Right. Yes. And you can see the other practices, we're looking at 20 to 25%. They're at negative 2.
Right. So 20% of 3 million, this practice easily should be clearing what, Jeff? 600,000.
Yeah, at least.
Profit.
Yeah.
So this owner really, as a decently managed practice, should be making 600,000 a year, and that's why we're calling it sad times.
Yes, and we do have other expenses. This is where the accountant comes in, and basically this profit loss statement is set up to find out how much taxes you got to pay. Right. So the accountant comes in and says, "Oh, we got this thing called depreciation." Which means you bought an asset, and that asset loses its value over time. You're allowed to claim that as an expense. And
like an x-ray machine, right?
Right.
You bought an x-ray machine for $100,000 and its useful life is
7 years, 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So you divide that and you kind of split it up and you log it as an expense on the P&L. But what's the
but not the whole thing unless you have the profit for it. But the depreciation, that is for tax purposes. That's the $26,000. They don't have to pay taxes on it, but they're already at negative, right? So that it really doesn't matter too much right here. But you'll also see miscellaneous income. Well, you have interest expense. This practice isn't paying on any debt, so that means it's a mature practice. They paid us their debt. We don't know what they have in credit cards, but anyway, they don't have any real debt. Miscellaneous income. This is kind of a catch-all for other things that practices do. Some practices do research. They might do trials at their practice. Most practices, what they do is they do online sales, And sometimes those online sales, since you don't have an expense with those online sales, it's passive income.
Right.
Miscellaneous income, when you do online sales, it's passive income. So we don't include it in the revenues above because that is active income.
Right.
Down here with miscellaneous income, this is passive income. And that's what we're trying to do that's where we would put that.
And curiously, this practice is the only way it's cash flow positive is actually because of this 97,000. So it looks like it's a negative number, but it's because the opposite of where
But it almost broke even.
right.
Almost with
So
the passive sales, right?
right. That probably breaks even on a cash basis because depreciation is a non-cash expense. Very, very important about depreciation. You
Right.
told the government that you spent $26,000 in depreciation, but you actually didn't. You're just showing an expense because it's a tax shield. A depreciation is a tax shield, but you actually didn't spend the cash. So if we add the depreciation back, and then we added back the owner's compensation, and then we added this miscellaneous income in the form of online pharmacy, the practice made what's 26 minus 10, so they're probably $15,000 in cash positive.
What you like to see is a big number that you have to pay taxes on. That would be a much better thing than not having only having $15,000 of profit ish.
Yes, absolutely.
Or negative $10,000. That's not where you want to be.
Yes, you don't want to be making 15,000 in reality.
Right?
This practice really should be making 600,000. And
Right.
it's because there's a general lack of expense discipline. Our cost of goods sold is too high. We talked about all the reasons why.
Right.
They have a variety of reasons why their payroll is high. Typically, our guess here, or Jeff doesn't have the guess. He knows exactly. It's a headcount issue on staff, and also their veterinarians are underutilized on their overhead. Just little things adding up over time of the lack of managing expenses. And then really the saving grace of this entire practice is their online pharmacy. Without that, they'd be in a negative cash flow position. And so what's left over is sad times, which is a negative net income, which is what you report to the government as what the net income is to the business.
I'm sad, John. I'm sad. I'm sad for this owner. I just saw them last year. I hope they pop up. I think they will. So
it's not a revenue. They don't have a revenue problem.
No,
that's the problem. They have plenty of revenue. And that would be the worst problem, right? When you have no revenue, that's hard to control. But they have plenty of revenue. It's really an expense problem.
I want to see happy times. I want to feel good, John.
Okay, let's see good times.
Let's see happy times, because there are good times ahead.
There are good times ahead, and the reason why we want to show you that is there you do have the ability to control revenue. So what does it look like to actually have expense discipline? And this is a very similar size practice, Jeff. What do we have here? In terms of revenue?
Good $3.7 million practice, right? And it has been, in the
give
threes.
us the story of Good Times.
Yeah, Good Times is a Northwestern practice. It's been around for 30 years. Really a high touch practice. And they have the proper systems in place to manage. They get monthly statements. They have KPIs. They meet with their staff weekly to go over their KPIs and key performance indicators, not only financial, but also what's going on with compliance, what's going on with just different revenue categories where they'd like to increase.
Because they're measuring, they can manage it.
Yes.
Even the intention of just having some sort of thing that we're measuring and trying to get better, you will often see that reflected in their profit and loss statement.
So bad times never met.
Right.
Good times met all the time, right? And so culturally, there are different practices. This was much more energy, had a lot more, and more people were involved in decision making. They felt more of a team than the other practice, right? So when you have key performance indicators in your practice, you can involve your team to help you manage those things, right? Otherwise, you're being intentional. The other practice was reactional.
Right.
Good times is intentional. The other practice wasn't.
No. So cost of goods sold here, they spent 800,000, 800 divided by 3.7 million. Here
Is
is at that
22%.
22% of revenue. So right in that target of 20 to 22%. They
Right?
may be able to eke out like a percentage point, but like you see a massive law of diminishing returns at this point, Jeff.
Right?
Like in order to
Yeah.
get it at 20 or below
Well,
that.
they actually were a little bit below this the prior year, but prices increased, and I think that they didn't adjust quite fast enough, and so that's why it's 22. You can see that change of 11.2% from the prior year. That is because they didn't change fast enough.
Right. And we see so many people get behind in terms of raising price because their wholesalers are raising price faster than they can raise price to their clients.
And sometimes several times a year.
Yes. Used to be annually, and then during the inflation kind of season of 2024 to 2025, multiple times a year price increases were happening,
Right?
not just every January.
So, and 22%, this was a person's responsibility too. They made sure that they had enough human capital toward this so they could manage it,
Right.
right? And so 22 is great.
Great. So they could get better, but really there is a law of diminishing returns. They probably need to look at their pricing probably to get it back towards 20.
Yeah.
But again, they're going to be subtle differences in terms of that, making sure that their Vetco, inside of Vetco, they have budgeting and all sorts of the X's and O's. But for the most part, this is definitely great.
Right.
And you want to see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and they were good users of a GPO. They were good users of VetCove, right? So
Yep.
they did good.
All right, on to payroll. Right here, the top line number here without the owner's comp, 36%, which is a good bit below 40%. Jeff, where are you seeing their performance here?
They really know how to use their people. They really do. To generate, I think they had 3.5 doctors. This was a little bit more of a rural practices, so we did see staff wages probably a little bit more suppressed. But overall, they were what I consider full capacity. They had the right amount of people, the right amount of technicians to doctors. This wasn't a low cost practice either. This was a practice that charged pretty above average, I would say, right?
Right.
Because you're above average, your payroll was a little bit lower than, say, the norm.
Right. So they have right on their staff payroll around 17%. To get that down even further, you almost would have to grow revenues while not hiring an additional staff member.
Right.
More than likely, or cross-training people so that, but again, it can be quite challenging really to get below that without under-resourcing, impacting the client experience, and a whole host of things. So I wouldn't really give much strong recommendation to Good Times to really drill that down further.
No.
But really doing the investing back in their people.
I mean, they're at 36.6% compared to 38.5, 39.6, and 39.7. So that's at 40%. The 20, 40, 15.
Right.
There it is, right?
Below 40. So I wouldn't investigate it too much. Jeff, do you have any comments on maybe why their associate wages are maybe lower than, what we've saw in terms of upper teens, kind of in the mid-teens here?
I think it's because they had, a little bit more part-time.
Okay. That were on a flat salary, maybe not based on
they had working moms. And the working moms said, you know what, I'll take a little bit less if I have more flexibility.
So basically, great expense discipline. We just looked at their COGS right in our window. Now we've gone down to payroll. Looks like their Jeff's in-clinic experience is that everyone's properly resourced. The headcount, the tech to DVM ratio is there. And we're having staff meetings. We're investing back in our people. That's not just money, but it's also trying to push the clinic forward and improve. And then we get down to...
John, can I make another point?
Yeah.
I will say that a lot of practices don't know how to use technicians because they're not meeting them with KPIs and telling them what they expect to do in rooms.
Right.
A lot of times they're glorified animal holders. Whenever you have a lot of glorified animal holders, you're going to pay more.
Right.
I mean, you just will. If you have people that are really trained you can get that staff number down because they know what to do, right?
Right. And DVMs just do what DVMs do. And
Right.
techs aren't just, assistants holding things. They're actually part of the care team doing what's within their like scope of care.
Right. So the more responsibilities they have, we do see where everybody understands what they're supposed to be doing. We do find that the cost of payroll does drop.
So good times. We're going down to overhead. Maybe let's talk a little bit about how they've managed their expenses in terms of overhead.
Well, again, I think they could probably get down on credit card fees, but their big expense is rent. And being up in the Northwest, it doesn't surprise me that rent is over
And just
5%.
to refresh people who are not looking, it's 20% of revenues here, which is a
Yes.
little bit higher than it should be.
Right.
15% was what we had said.
Right. And we see taxes and licenses there. So the reason why their payroll is also a little bit lower is because under taxes and licenses, this is where the accountant put all the payroll taxes.
Yes.
So that number should be up at payroll, and that's probably one of the reasons why the
Yes.
overhead expenses are a little bit on the higher side is because they got payroll expenses in that.
Well said. And also another advertisement to have a veterinary specific accountant to make sure that you're putting the buckets in the right categories.
Right.
Or having Jeff like a consultant or me coming in and having to manually like fix these P&Ls that should just be automatically set up appropriately because they understand how vet clinics work.
Right. I also think their professional fees, it's on the high side, but it's not 100,000, it's 50,000. I think that could be down around 30,000.
Right.
If they just negotiate. I don't know what that number includes. I don't know if there's some accounting and attorneys in there. I don't know.
Right. If you right size the taxes and licenses, more than likely this number is going to be touching 15%, and
Right.
Payroll is probably going to be more up towards the 40%. So more than likely, this is not that. Actually, it's pretty close to what we would expect.
So really, when you normalize the payroll taxes, you would be at 18%, which is going to be not that bad, right?
Right.
They're also up in the Northwest. It's just a little bit more expensive
Cost
there
of
for
living.
things, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So, but I can't wait to see what's the rest of the story there, John.
Right. So now we go down to EBITDA, right? So that COGS was 22%. Our payroll was south of 40. Our overhead is probably south of 20. And so how much profitability does the practice have, Jeff?
Actual EBITDA is almost $783,000 compared to almost a very close comparison
Revenues.
to sad times. Look at that difference. $700,000 and $780,000 difference between the two.
Right. The other one was a negative number. This
right.
one is...
Well, it probably by what? Almost 800,000. So they're God. You just gotta wonder. And that's one thing I think is really important is it's not what your practice is doing. I think you have to have comparables. You need to look at the benchmarks. You have it from Dr. Younker, 20, 40, 15, right? That's the benchmarks. But you also want to look at comps and see what other people are paying for things, right? Because there's lots of things that are in each one of those things. And you want to see how you're doing compared to other practices. Are you paying more or less in pretty much every line item, if you can?
Right.
Right.
So, Jeff, just to sum up today's episode, maybe give us okay, this was a lot. We went down line by line on a P&L. What do the best practice owners do in terms of managing expenses?
Well, they don't drive blind. They get their financial statements every month and they review them with their accountant, and they should be also reviewing them with the benchmarks, the 20, 40, 15, right? They should be looking at that and seeing how they compare. From that, if you're off, respond, figure out what's going on. Don't wait, right? It might not get better. So figure out what's going on. Is it a system thing? Is it in your software? Is it in how you do things? Is it a behavior thing? Find out what's going on. And I think you'll find that if you pursue this, we call it bird dogging in the Southeast, I guess, but you bird dog those issues and figure out what is the culprit. And once you find out the culprit, now you understand your practice better. And when you understand your practice better, you're going to have a better practice, which means you're going to have a better culture, better way of doing things. And people are just going to be happier, right? Because you're earning a return on an investment, and you'll be able to reward your people better when you're making more money.
Right. But if you're too busy seeing patients to do any of this, right?
Right.
You don't know what, as a veterinarian, you don't know what to do. Maybe paralysis by analysis, too much KPIs, too much business talk. I guess I'm just going to see another patient.
Yeah.
You do that at the expense of the business.
Right. And you have to make time for your business, which means you have to have time with your CPA. You also need to look at your data, and you need to spend time with your people to give them direction on where to go. And when you do that, that's where what you build practices that are going somewhere and not just being reactional.
Exactly.
Being flat.
Well said, Jeff. Thank you so much for
giving us. Thank you, Dr. Younker. I appreciate it. I had fun.
Yeah, we'll
awesome.
definitely do this again. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for sticking around and getting line by line detail on a P&L and how you would go about attacking that to improve that for your business. Again, Jeff, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one.
I appreciate you.